P-8A Poseidon banks slowly over blue water, radar sweeping the coast below. The island on the left side of the frame is Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, the same 90 miles it has always been. And somewhere over the horizon on the other side of the planet, a carrier strike group holds position at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, engines turning, aircraft armed, watching. 2 theaters, 1 navy, and a hard mathematical ceiling nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Here is the problem the Pentagon is living with right now. The United States Navy fields the most powerful fleet on Earth. 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, dozens of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, a global logistics chain built over 80 years, and yet at this particular moment, the math of simultaneous commitments is exposing something the budget briefings have always papered over. You cannot be everywhere at once, and the bill for trying is coming due. The question this video is built around is a simple one. Why is the Pentagon reportedly stacking the building blocks of a potential Cuba operation? Surveillance flights, repositioned assets, quiet diplomatic signaling, while the bulk of its deployable fleet is tied down 12,000 kilometers away managing a Gulf blockade. The answer is not what you might expect. And the strategy that answer reveals is either a masterstroke of economy or a gamble that leaves one theater critically exposed. We are going to work through every layer of that before the end. Stay with us. The strangest part is not that the Navy is stretched. Navies are always stretched. The strangest part is how Pentagon planners are trying to solve the problem. Not by moving ships, but by moving sensors. One P-8A Poseidon sortie, one surveillance pass over the Florida Strait, costs a fraction of what it takes to reposition a $9 billion carrier strike group across an ocean. That asymmetry is the entire logic, and it is either brilliant or it is a bluff that a serious adversary will eventually call. To understand how the United States arrived at this specific bind, you have to go back to the architecture of the fleet itself. How many carrier groups can actually be ready at any given moment? What it takes to maintain a credible forward presence in 2 separate ocean theaters, and why the Strait of Hormuz became the gravity well pulling so much of the Navy's deployable power into its orbit. The U.S. Navy operates 11 Nimitz-class and Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carriers. On paper, that sounds overwhelming. In practice, the number that matters is not 11, it is the number that are actually ready to deploy and sustain combat operations at any given time. Maintenance cycles, crew training rotations, the Ford-class electromagnetic catapult integration work that has stretched timelines on the newest hulls, all of it shrinks the operational pool sharply. At any moment, realistic planning figures suggest roughly 3 to 4 carrier strike groups are genuinely ready for sustained high-end tasking. 3 to 4, that is the real fleet. And right now, the Persian Gulf theater is consuming the better part of it. The Hormuz commitment did not materialize overnight. It built through a sequence of escalating pressure, healthy anti-ship missile attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea that began in late 2023, urgy fast boat harassment in the Gulf itself, the mining threat that never fully disappeared after the tanker war era, and a broader campaign by Iran-aligned forces to signal that the waterway is contestable. By early 2025, keeping commercial traffic moving through Hormuz required a persistent American naval presence that consumed carrier air wings, Aegis cruiser magazines, and destroyer patrols on a scale that planners had not budgeted for in the post-Afghanistan drawdown years. The USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, with its air wing of FCA-18 Super Hornets and EA-18G Growlers, has been part of that sustained Gulf commitment. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers like USS Cole and USS Gravely have cycled through their SPY-1D radars scanning for Shahed-136 drones and for the anti-ship ballistic missiles that Iran's Revolutionary Guard has demonstrated it can reach into the Gulf with. SM-6 interceptors, Phalanx Xiao's close-in weapon systems, the layered Aegis architecture, all of it burning through maintenance hours and munitions stocks to hold a line at Hormuz. What is striking about this commitment is how thoroughly it has reshaped the global deployment calculus. The Hormuz presence was supposed to be a deterrence posture, ships visible, credible, discouraging. What it became is a sustained combat-ready garrison, and the difference in resource consumption between those two things is enormous. Then, in the spring of 2026, a second theater started demanding attention. The Cuba file reopened, not with a military confrontation, but with a pattern of signals Pentagon planners could not ignore. intelligence reporting on foreign military activity in and around the island, diplomatic friction under the Trump administration's renewed pressure campaign against Havana, and the geographic reality that Cuba sits astride several of the most critical maritime approaches to the American Southeast. The challenge was not that Cuba posed an imminent military threat in the conventional sense. The challenge was that leaving the approaches to the Florida Strait unmonitored while the fleet was fully committed elsewhere was a strategic gap adversaries could exploit, and that the window to address it cheaply through surveillance and positioning was narrower than it looked. 90 miles from Key West, that is the distance. The same geography that made the 1962 missile crisis the most dangerous 13 days of the Cold War. The same coastline, the same approaches, the same leverage that a foreign power with access to Cuban basing could use to complicate U.S. naval movement between the Atlantic and the Gulf. So Pentagon planners ran the numbers, and the numbers produced a surveillance-first answer, not a carrier, not a Marine Expeditionary Unit, not an Arleigh Burke destroyer on a visible patrol line, a P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft flying out of NAS Jacksonville or a forward operating location, conducting systematic reconnaissance of the Florida Strait and the approaches to Cuba. The economics of this choice are stark, and they tell you almost everything about the strategy. Operating a full carrier strike group, 1 Gerald R. Ford-class or Nimitz-class carrier, 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, or Arleigh Burke destroyers in screening, a Virginia-class submarine, a supply ship, an air wing of 70 to 80 aircraft, costs roughly $2 to $3 million per day just in operating expenses, before you factor in the fuel consumption of a nuclear-powered ship running at sea above economical speed, the sortie costs of each FCA-18 Super Hornet flight, or the wear on Aegis systems that have been running continuously for months. Moving that group from the Gulf to the Caribbean takes weeks. Transit time alone from the Persian Gulf to the Florida Strait runs approximately 3 to 4 weeks at standard naval transit speeds. A P-8A Poseidon sortie, by contrast, costs in the range of $50,000 to $100,000 per flight hour all in, depending on accounting method. A full surveillance mission over the Florida Strait, 12 hours, acoustic buoys dropped, radar sweeps logged, signals intelligence collected, comes in at a cost orders of magnitude below what a single day of carrier group operations runs. That asymmetry is the foundation of the current approach. Watch Cuba from the air. Maintain the intelligence picture. Buy time. Do not spend carrier days you do not have. The problem, and this is the part that does not sit right when you look at it closely, is that watching is not the same as deterring. A P-8A Poseidon can tell you that something is happening off the Cuban coast. It cannot stop it. An acoustic buoy can detect a submarine transiting the Florida Strait. It cannot block that submarine. There is a gap between surveillance coverage and actual military power projection, and that gap is currently being papered over by the logic that the fleet's commitment at Hormuz takes priority. Put yourself in the position of a Navy planner at the Pentagon right now. You have 3 credibly ready carrier strike groups. One is at Hormuz. One is in a maintenance cycle or pre-deployment training rotation. One is theoretically available, but the Chief of Naval Operations has flagged to Congress that the Readiness account, the funding that keeps ships maintained, crews trained, and magazines stocked, runs dry by July without a supplemental appropriation. Every ship hour you spend in a second theater is a ship hour not available at the first. Here is the take that will probably draw some disagreement. The surveillance-only approach near Cuba is not a strategy, it is a placeholder. It buys time and generates intelligence, but it does not change the military balance in the region, and any adversary who has done the same force availability math the Pentagon has done knows exactly how thin the coverage is. The P-8A flights are visible. The absence of a carrier is equally visible. Surveillance without the credible threat of follow-on force is reconnaissance, not deterrence. That said, the alternative is worse. Pull a carrier strike group off the Hormuz commitment to address Cuba, and you remove the one asset currently keeping commercial traffic moving through the world's most critical oil choke point. The healthy anti-ship missile threat in the Red Sea did not disappear. Erg fast boats in the Gulf did not stand down. The tanker traffic that represents roughly 20% of global oil supply does not have another route. The price of that choice is paid at the pump, in shipping insurance rates, in the bond markets. The math of the dilemma is straightforward. The Navy covers Hormuz with a full carrier strike group and accepts a surveillance-only posture near Cuba, betting that airborne sensors and the implicit threat of eventual force deployment are sufficient. Or it pulls something from the Gulf to address Cuba more robustly and accepts that the Hormuz commitment becomes thinner. Fewer destroyer screens, less carrier air-wing availability for surge operations, a degraded ability to respond to the next Iranian escalation. Each choice spends something scarce, and right now both accounts are already overdrawn. What would you do at this point? Hold Hormuz at full strength and cover Cuba on the cheap with aircraft, or accept the risk at the strait to put real hardware near the island? Comment your answer. We read every one of them. The readiness warning the Chief of Naval Operations delivered to Congress in early 2026 is worth dwelling on because it puts specific numbers on a problem that tends to get discussed in abstractions. The warning was not about ships. The Navy has ships. The warning was about money. The operations and maintenance account, the funding line that pays for fuel, spare parts, the depot maintenance that keeps destroyers and carriers actually functional rather than tied to a pier with a maintenance tag on the reactor plant, that account was flagged as running critically low. The July timeline for the shortfall is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a planning constraint shaping decisions right now. What this means in practice is that every ship day spent in an unplanned commitment, a second theater that was not in the deployment schedule when the budget was written, accelerates the drawdown of that account. The Cuba surveillance flights, the repositioned P-8A Poseidon assets, the enhanced monitoring of the Florida Strait, none of that is free. It is funded from the same overcommitted pot that is supposed to keep the Arleigh Burke destroyers at Hormuz mission capable for the next rotation. Going through the force structure documents and congressional testimony, one figure kept coming back. The gap between the number of carrier groups the Navy is being asked to sustain in forward deployments and the number the current budget actually supports is not small. It is structural. It has been growing for years. The Cuba-Hormuz bind is not a crisis created by current events. It is the visible expression of a gap that has been building since the post-2011 drawdown years. The Virginia-class submarine force is part of this picture too. Virginia-class boats, nuclear-powered, fast, capable of operating in both theaters without surface signature, are doing work in this environment that surface ships cannot do quietly. A submarine transiting to a patrol station off the Cuban coast does not show up in commercial satellite imagery the way a carrier does. It does not generate the diplomatic noise that moving a carrier strike group creates. And it maintains a deterrence capability the P-8A flights cannot replicate. But Virginia-class boats have their own maintenance cycles, their own crew rotation requirements, and the force is not unlimited. What this tells us about the era we are in. The United States built a Navy designed to project power globally and simultaneously, and then funded it at a level that makes genuine simultaneity impossible. The 11-carrier fleet is a planning fiction when the real deployable number is 3 to 4 ready groups, 2 of which can be genuinely committed at any moment without beginning to cannibalize readiness. The Cuba-Hormuz situation is that fiction becoming visible. The surveillance-first approach near Cuba has a strategic logic beyond just cost. It is also about escalation management. Sailing a carrier strike group into waters close to Cuba sends a signal that is hard to walk back, diplomatically, politically, and in terms of the military response it might invite from any foreign power that has made investments in Cuban access. Flying a P-8A Poseidon is surveillance. It is observable, it is legal under international law over international waters, and it maintains the intelligence picture without committing to a force posture that constrains the next decision. The Reagan-era playbook for the Caribbean was built on forward presence, carriers in the region, marine amphibious forces within range, the implicit message that any challenge to American primacy in the Western Hemisphere would be met with overwhelming and immediate response. That posture cost money, and it cost ship days, but it worked precisely because it was credible. The question now is whether credibility can be maintained on a surveillance budget, or whether the visible reduction in presence communicates something to adversaries that the P-8A flights cannot compensate for. The Trump administration has signaled significant interest in reasserting American primacy in the Western Hemisphere. The pressure campaign on Havana is consistent with that posture. Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense has framed the readiness problem in terms that emphasize the need for supplemental funding to close the operations and maintenance gap. But framing the problem is not the same as solving it, and the timeline between the political signal and the actual deployment of credible military power runs through the same bottleneck: a fleet that is already fully committed. The transit time issue is not abstract. From the Persian Gulf to the Caribbean, a carrier strike group moving at standard transit speed covers roughly 500 to 600 nautical miles per day. The distance from the Gulf of Oman to the Florida Strait is approximately 12,000 nautical miles. Do the division, 3 to 4 weeks minimum, and that assumes the group can be released from its Gulf commitment immediately. No handoff period. No overlap with the next rotation. No allowance for the fact that reducing the Hormuz presence while Iran is still conducting harassment operations would be read as a signal by Tehran. That transit gap is the crisis clock problem. If something develops near Cuba that requires a rapid military response, the Navy cannot get a carrier there in time from the Gulf. The response would have to come from whatever is already in the region. The surveillance assets, the P-8A flights, whatever submarine presence exists, and whatever surface combatants might be within range from Mayport or Norfolk. Enough for surveillance. Not enough for a serious power projection operation. There is a human dimension to the numbers that the budget documents do not capture. The crews of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers cycling through the Gulf commitment have been operating at a sustained high tempo for months. Destroyer crews run roughly 300 personnel, carrier air wing crews, the FCA-18 Super Hornet pilots, the EA-18G Growler electronic warfare crews, the E-2D Hawkeye early warning aviators, have been maintaining flight operations in an environment where Houthi anti-ship missiles and Iranian ballistic missiles are genuine threats, not training scenarios. The Phalanx Sius systems and the SM-6 interceptor magazines have been exercised in real engagements. The P-8A Poseidon crews flying the Cuba surveillance missions are doing different work: long overwater patrol missions, acoustic monitoring, radar sweeps, but they are drawing from the same personnel pool, the same training pipeline, the same maintenance support structure. The Navy's personnel system is under pressure from the same overcommitment that is stressing the readiness account. You can sustain a higher operational tempo for a period. You cannot sustain it indefinitely without accepting degraded readiness on the back end. One detail that stayed with me in going through the force posture reporting: the gap between the Navy's stated requirement for deployable carrier groups, the number the war plans actually call for, and the number that can be sustained within the current budget is not a rounding error. It is a systemic shortfall acknowledged in various forms in every major defense review since 2018. The Cuba-Hormuz simultaneity problem is that shortfall expressed in geographic terms. 2 theaters, each requiring credible presence, each competing for the same 3 to 4 available groups. The answer the Navy has settled on: sensors first, iron second, reflects a genuine shift in how American military planners think about power projection under constrained resources. A P-8A Poseidon, equipped with its APS-154 Advanced Airborne Sensor System, can cover ocean area that would require multiple surface combatants to monitor continuously. An MQ-4C Triton unmanned maritime patrol drone can stay on station for extended periods at a fraction of the crew cost of a surface ship. The intelligence picture generated by these assets is genuinely good, but here is the inescapable physical constraint. Sensors do not have magazines. A P-8A cannot intercept an anti-ship missile targeting a US-flagged vessel. An MQ-4C cannot establish sea control over the Florida Strait. Surveillance tells you what is happening. Only Hull, with weapons, establishes what can happen next. The bind the Pentagon finds itself in is not a failure of strategy. It is the honest expression of a resource ceiling meeting a geography problem. A Navy built for global power projection needs global resources to fund it. The Cuba-Hormuz situation makes visible what the budget has always obscured. There is a number of simultaneous commitments beyond which the fleet cannot credibly cover all of them, and that number is smaller than the number of theaters currently demanding presence. The choice, reduced to its simplest form, is this: hold Hormuz at full strength, keep the oil moving, keep the blockade credible, accept that Cuba gets covered on the cheap by P-8A Poseidon flights and quiet submarine presence, and hope that the adversary calculation does not change. or pull a carrier strike group out of the Gulf rotation to address Cuba with genuine power projection capability, and accept that the Hormuz posture becomes thinner at the precise moment when Iran's calculus about what it can get away with is being tested. Each choice spends something scarce. Hormuz spends carrier days the Cuba theater needs. Cuba pulls carriers that Hormuz cannot replace quickly. And the readiness account that funds both runs down toward July, regardless of which theater gets priority. Most people assume that having the world's largest navy means you can cover every contingency. The evidence tells a different story. The real constraint is not hulls, it is ready hulls, and the gap between the two has been growing for years. We'll say what most won't. The surveillance-only approach near Cuba is the right call given the constraints, but only if it remains a temporary placeholder backed by a credible commitment to surge real capability when the readiness funding is restored. If the July budget warning goes unaddressed, the P-8A flights stop being a strategic choice and start being a strategic default, and those are very different things. Before we close, here's the question we actually want you to think about. The Pentagon is making a bet. Watch Cuba from the air, hold Hormuz with iron, and hope the two theater demands do not peak simultaneously. Given what you now know about the transit time, the readiness timeline, and the cost asymmetry between sensors and carriers, which side of that trade would you take? Accept the surveillance gap near Cuba and maintain the Gulf commitment at full strength, or pull something from Hormuz and accept the risk at the Strait? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to see how the Hormuz commitment actually works, the layered Aegis architecture, the SM-6 engagement envelopes, why an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the specific asset Iran's planners worry about most. That breakdown is next.